Hello everybody and welcome to the 5th event in the Future Abroad series for 2022. My name is Alex, I'm from Insider Guides and I will be your host for today's webinar. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to them and to their cultures and to elders both past, present and emerging. Let us walk together and take care of earth and water as one. If you're considering a permanent migration to Australia, there are a number of pathways that you can take. General skilled migration is part of Australia's skilled migration program. The skilled migration program allows people with in-demand skills to migrate to Australia without an employer sponsor. In this session, we'll be explaining everything that you need to know about the skilled migration program to Australia. Today, we will be joined by Julie Williams, Registered Migration Agent, owner of Migration Down Under, and a Fellow and National President and Director of the Migration Institute of Australia. Thank you so much for joining us today, Julie. Speaking of thanks, I would also like to thank the sponsor of today's webinar, PTE Academic. For many international students, English language testing is one of the first steps of their study abroad experience. With PTE Academic, that step is made a whole lot easier. By using powerful technology, PTE Academic takes just 2 hours to test your English and provides accurate results available within 2 days. Whether you're improving your skills for study, work or migration, PTE Academic has you covered. You can find out more about PTE by clicking the link. You'll find that in the chat box now. So a huge thank you again. It's wonderful to see so many of you joining us for today's Future Abroad webinar. Today's session will be recorded, so there will be a copy of today that will come out in an email after we've wrapped things up. But again, a portion of today's webinar will include a live webinar. So we're going to commence with a presentation from Julie, and then we will finish with a live webinar. With the live Q&A, however, we ask that you keep the questions as general in nature as possible, and we recommend that you contact your institution with any questions you have before arrival to have your questions answered. We will only be answering questions live that are general in nature. We'll be sharing lots of links in the chat during the session, and as I said, today's session will be recorded, so you can expect that in your inbox within the next few days. It will also be made available on the Future Abroad website. We'll share a link to the Future Abroad website now, and we'll make sure that we include that in the chat later on in today's session as well. I would now like to pass it over to Julie for her presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Julie.
Thank you very much, Alex. Pleasure to be here. Good afternoon or good morning, everybody, wherever you may be around Australia and around the globe. Welcome. I look forward to sharing with you the insights of migration and options for you to progress from your student visa. So I'm going to be sharing a few slides here. Sorry, I'll just get that up. Oops, sorry. Sorry, I seem to be having trouble there with putting it into the full view. While I'm just doing that, I'm just wanting to reiterate what Alex mentioned today. We're not going to be answering any specific questions to individual cases. We're going to be talking generally through the program of how we can pathway from a student visa to residence for you all. We, as Alex mentioned, I'm a registered migration agent with Migration Down Under. I'm also the current National President of the Migration Institute of Australia, which is the professional association for immigration advisors, both registered migration agents and legal practitioners. And that's very important if you are going to be looking at utilising and getting advice from an advisor, that they are a registered migration agent or an accredited specialist in immigration law. So I'm just trying to still get that full screen. I apologise. So what we're going to be doing through today, we're going to be talking about choosing a career rather than a visa, stepping stone to permanent residency, and pathways to permanent residency for skilled workers. So in regards to, I'm still trying, sorry, having technical technical difficulties in getting that that full screen, so I do apologise there. Just in regards to choosing a career, what does it look like in regards to skilled migration? Many people make the mistake of coming to me and saying, all right, please tell me which course should I be studying? And that's not the right approach if you're wanting to obtain permanent residency, if that's your key goal at the end of the day. Because the requirement after you have studied for a skilled migration is to be able to have experience in that area of expertise. So the best option is to choose something you're going to be enjoying, because studying in Australia, as we all know, is certainly not cheap, and you don't want to be studying something that you're not enjoying. The likelihood of you then finding employment upon the completion of your studies, if you're doing something that you're enjoying, is going to be far more beneficial than trying to fit in for the purpose of a visa. Because as we know, the occupation list can change at any time. So whilst you're choosing something that you think may gain you permanent, sort of fast track you to permanent residency, it's not necessarily going to be the same occupation list when you complete your studies. So there's the fact there is that there's no guarantee to permanent residency, because immigration changes all the time. And it is exciting times at the moment, because we've got a new government that's just begun. They are very much focused on skilled migration, and also making certain that there is a pathway for temporary residents to pathway into permanent residency. There was a very long time ago a sort of a or not necessarily a policy, but a pathway for students to pathway into residency wasn't always clear cut, but that's something the government is going to be looking at. Now, generally speaking, the skilled occupation list comes out, or it changes, especially for the states and territories, from the 1st of July. But because we have got a new government and they've only just begun and they haven't started sitting for Parliament, there has been no discussion and no dialogue yet as to what those new occupation lists look like, although Western Australia does have their current occupation list out there. So how does it look for skilled migration in the year ahead? We're looking at this independent more so than the employer-sponsored. And now that we're past the pandemic, or fingers crossed, as we tend to be getting hit with another wave, but I don't think that's going to change immigration, because we're beyond the border closures, and now we're looking ahead at the economy and how we can increase that, improve Australia's economy, and that is through skilled migration. So there is going to be an increase from for this financial year, 150% from the last couple of years for skilled independent. So that's really good news for people that are looking at applying through that pathway, because there's going to be a lot more invitations coming through. There's also a big increase of, for regional visas as well, and an increase to state nominated. So the increase with state nominations, you're going to see a lot more broader occupations on those lists. And again, that hasn't been set yet, because the federal government is only new. They haven't actually looked at discussing it through independently with all the states at this stage. Now, choosing the right course, as I mentioned, follow your passion, follow your goal, because at the end of the day, that's going to get you permanent residence. Being in migration for as long as I have been practicing for over 20 years now, I see a lot, and it continues, students coming to say, what's the best course to study to get to gain a visa, to gain permanent residency at the end of the day? And really, there's no clear-cut answer to that. Again, it's something that you should be passionate about. But there are some key occupations that the government are focusing on at the moment. Certainly IT and software engineering, cybersecurity, etc. That's certainly not going to go away in the near future. So anything in the IT sector is certainly going to obtain some form of pathway into residency for you. Construction is also another big focus for the government, whether that be as engineers, engineering or trades. Both engineering and trades, construction project managers are all occupations in demand and will continue to be over the next few years. So that's certainly also an area to look out for. Health and medical, that's certainly going to continue, especially in the light of the recent pandemic, and as that the challenges continue to face us with the health and medical sector, that is certainly going to be an area of continued demand. And occupations that you're looking at there would be, of course, doctors, general practitioners, but also registered nurses, aged care workers, disability workers, social workers, psychiatrists. They're all occupations that are going to, not necessarily, I don't want to use the word guarantee, but they're certainly going to set you up in good stead to a pathway to permanent residency. Other areas are around trades, such as hospitality. We've seen a big demand in hospitality since the pandemic. Chefs in particular, also to a certain extent cooks, and also restaurant managers. So that's an area too. And other trades as well, such as carpenters, builders, electricians, plumbers. So you don't necessarily have to be seeking a university degree, because the trades are also certainly in demand. So anything in those sort of areas is certainly going to put you in good stead for a pathway into permanent residency. And as we've got there, Australia is home to some very good universities. Many are in the top 100 universities around the world, and Insider's Guide have great links to the different universities that are out there and are available to you. All right, so what should you consider about courses that lead you to the permanent residency? You should be looking at completing at least a minimum of 2 years study in Australia to be able to obtain what's called a graduate visa at the end of the day. Some of you may be coming to study straight out of secondary school. Some of you may have started studying here in Australia through secondary education, and now you've gone on to tertiary education to a bachelor degree. Some of you may have come in to do your masters. You've already completed a bachelor degree in your country and you've come to Australia to complete further studies. Just be mindful when you are doing a master's degree that a lot of them fall short of the 2-year requirement. And you do need to complete a minimum of 2 years or 92 weeks to be able to be considered for any form of postgraduate student visa. So the postgraduate visa, there is a 485. It is a study work stream, as also the temporary graduate visa. The course that you've studied has to be an approved CRICOS course. And the good news is that if you're nearing the end of your studies and that you're getting towards looking at applying for a 485 visa, there is a number of concessions that are currently in place due to the pandemic. So, for example, the post-study work stream, you need to have completed a bachelor degree to get the 4-year visa. There's some concessions for the other stream whereby you've done a diploma or a vocational course. You have to, previously you have had to have completed a skills assessment, and often that's quite difficult for candidates to be able to meet the requirements for that. And the good news is that for up until June next year, you'll be able to apply for both 485 streams without having to go through the skills assessment criteria. And instead of an 18-month visa for those that have studied a diploma, you'll be able to obtain a 2-year visa. So that's really good, because the reason for the 485 visa and why it's really important as a stepping stone into permanent residency is the key to permanent residency is that you've got to be skilled. You've got to not only be qualified with a tertiary qualification, whether that be a degree qualification, whether that be a diploma, whether that be a trade. You can't only just have your qualification to be considered skilled. You have to have relevant work experience. And that's the big push with the Australian government, and especially with the current federal government at the moment, and also the state and territory governments who are seeking to nominate people through the skilled independent or the skilled sponsored, state-sponsored pathway. The emphasis is on work experience, because just because you've got the qualification doesn't mean you're experienced. You have to have the work experience. And the minimum requirement usually is at least 12 months to gain any form of points on the independent and also the state-nominated pathways. So if you've got a minimum of 12 months, then it's going to be able to give you more points, more opportunities to be able to seek that permanent residency. So the 485 is a really good stepping stone, and it gives you that opportunity to obtain that relevant work experience, because there's no conditions at all on the 485 as to where you work, what line of work you do, how you work, whether you work for one or two employers. But my advice for you on the 485, don't waste the opportunity. I see so many people that are qualified, perhaps as a software engineer, perhaps as an electrical engineer, and they're working in hospitality, for example. Just because you've got a degree and you're working in an area that is an occupation on the list, it's not going to help you for pathwaying into permanent residency, because you really do need to have the relevant work experience that is related to your course of study. So don't waste the time on the 485, because you have studied in Australia. You're going to be a lot more attractive to Australian employers, and gaining that relevant work experience is going to put you in good stead to be able to apply for permanent residency. Because when we go through, and as I'll explain as we go through the slides, with obtaining permanent residency, whether that be through the skilled independent or whether the state nominated, the focus is on those that are already here in Australia working in their relevant occupation. So you're already a step ahead from anyone that's applying from offshore. If you're currently here in Australia, if you've studied in Australia, if you've got your graduate visa, that ability to work in Australia, then that puts you in good stead ahead of everybody else. So as I said, the other one, sorry, is I should explain that a little bit more, because I did only briefly touch over that. The post-study work stream is for those that have completed a bachelor, a master's, and applied and held a student visa after the 5th of November 2011, I think that is, it's hidden there. And then the graduate work stream visa is for those that have completed a diploma or a vocational course. Now, generally speaking, the requirement is to have a skills assessment. The requirement is to have an occupation listed on the medium long-term skilled occupation list, and have completed 2 years study of Australia. Well, that has all changed from the 1st of July this year, and it will continue through to the 30th of June next year. You still have to have completed 2 years of study in Australia. That certainly hasn't changed. So you do need to meet that requirement. But the good news is that you don't need to go through and get a skills assessment. So it's one less thing you need to worry about. And it's also one less expense as well. And you don't necessarily have to have an occupation on the medium long-term list. You might have studied something in an occupation on the short-term list. So this is your opportunity to seize the moment to get that visa and be able to gain experience in your relevant occupation, because that's that's the key of gaining permanent residency. But do be mindful when you are applying for the subclass 485 visa. Many people get very giddy and go and lodge it thinking it's really quite simple. Just fill this form out, attach a few documents, and oh, look, don't worry, I haven't got that document. I'll attach that that later, but that is not the case. Be really mindful that you check what the requirements are at the time of application, because there's many things that you've got to do prior to applying. It's too late after you've lodged that application to then apply, for example, your Australian Federal Police clearance. I see so many people that are in the AAT, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, because they haven't followed the process. So just be mindful, you don't want to be able to slip by not applying for the right thing there. The overview of how to apply for residency. Now, as we said, the focus is not on employer-sponsored. We are talking about general skilled, which is going to be my next slide. But just in case, I thought I'd briefly mention this, because a lot of people do have an opportunity that they are sponsored, because they may have looked at applying for independent, but they might not have the points to gain a permanent residency independently. So there are options for employers to sponsor you as well. There is the 482 and also the 186. Sorry, I seem to have got the wrong slide there. So the 482 visa is a temporary visa, and depending on your occupation, if it's on the medium long-term list, you can get up to 4 years experience. But it's also might be a stepping stone on gaining permanent residency if you haven't quite got sufficient experience. If you're on the 485, and perhaps you may have not been able to gain permanent residency whilst on the 485. So you're crossing over to an employer to perhaps supplement your work experience to enable you to get sufficient experience to jump into that permanent residency. So there's a few different options, but to be sponsored by an employer, you must have a minimum of 2 years relevant work experience. So you've got to have that before you can even consider the temporary work visa. If you're looking at the permanent residency, to apply for permanent residency through an employer sponsored, you must have a minimum of 3 years. But I'm going to go back to the general skilled pathways, because that's the one that we're all keen on. That's the one that the government has also, at the same time, supporting employer sponsored. They're also going to be increasing the numbers of independent visa pathways for permanent residency, which is good news because it allows flexibility, especially if you're working in the IT sector where you're working as perhaps a contractor and you're wanting to be able to work for more than one employer. So the independent pathway is certainly a good way to do it. Up until recently, that has stopped throughout the pandemic, because while our borders were closed, they were focusing on the family migration. So now that the borders are open, we're in a new financial year, the focus is certainly on the skilled 189, the skilled nominated 190, and the skilled regional 491. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of what that is, the independent 189 doesn't require any sponsorship from any state sponsor, doesn't require you to be in a regional area, and you just need to have the relevant points to be able to apply or lodge an expression of interest. Now, whilst the points for an expression of interest is currently 65 points, the more you have, the more likely it is that you're going to be picked up to be invited to submit and lodge a permanent residency application. So, for example, the history shows us and current experience shows us that unless you've got around sort of 90 points, you're not going to be selected for an invitation to apply for permanent residency. So that's why some people go for state nomination, because they'll gain 5 points. And often if they're working in the occupation already in that state, then it's going to be more likely that they're going to be selected and picked up by that state. Now, each state and territory has their own relevant skilled occupation list. They have their own requirements, and it's all set up as to what they need to boost their economy in their current state or territory. So you need to be mindful when you're looking at that. you're more likely going to be invited if you already have studied in that particular state or you've already currently been living in that state. So studying and working in a relevant state that you're interested in applying for permanent residency is definitely going to be an advantage for you, if other than if you're working in a state and trying to, for example, living in New South Wales and trying to apply through South Australia. You may get an invitation, but you're going to be looked upon more favourably if you're already working and living in that particular state. The same goes with the skilled regional. There's so many great universities and education providers in regional areas of Australia, and regional doesn't necessarily have to mean remote. Regional is anywhere at the moment classified, as far as immigration purposes are concerned, anywhere outside of Melbourne, Sydney or Brisbane. So for example, if you're in New South Wales, it could be Wollongong, it could be Newcastle. If you're in Victoria, it could be Geelong. All of Adelaide and, all of South Australia, Western Australia are all considered regional areas. So again, you could be in Perth, you could be in Adelaide, which are all metropolitan cities. So regional doesn't always necessarily mean remote. And if you're in New South Wales and Victoria, they've got some great regional centres that have terrific education providers, which you'll find all the links through Insider's Guide on their website. So again, there is an advantage if you are studying in a regional area, because the government previously and the current government now is going to continue to promote the regional sectors to be able, because as our metropolitan areas continue to grow and almost become quite crowded, they are encouraging and giving more concessions for those that are studying and working in a regional area. Just in regards to the skilled occupation lists for the different different visa classes, such as the 189, 190, 491. I know a lot of you have been asking how often do they change these occupation lists? Well, traditionally they tend to change them. They used to just once a year, then it was twice a year. But due to the pandemic, there hasn't been any major change at all. And you may or may not be aware, but a skills summit has been announced just recently this week by the Prime Minister that's going to be held in the first week of September. And that's going to include the education, the Department of Education, the Department of Employment, not just the Department of Home Affairs, various trade unions, various different associations and employment bodies, to work together and brainstorm what's going to best work for them to help fill the skill shortages. So after that summit, we may see a change or a recommendation to the occupation lists. The occupation list, even though that's in September, I doubt we'll see any change occur until possibly the earliest next year, because as these things occur, as we probably know, it takes time for them to be implemented, even though they are going to be announced. Also, how do occupations come about as being on the list, and how, excuse me, what happens if they are removed and how does that occur? It depends on the trends. It depends on the skill shortage trends. It depends on what is being advised, and it's not influenced by the Department of Immigration. It's very much influenced by the Department of Employment. So that in conjunction with relevant association bodies and various unions, etc., they're looking and monitoring to see where the skill shortages are, where perhaps there's no longer any skill shortages, and that's where we'll see a change in the occupation list. Sometimes occupations might be moved from different lists, sometimes they might be added, might be taken away. Do we get any notification? Sometimes we do. It might be, they used to use a traffic light system where they'd show that if they were red, it was likely that they were going to be removed. If they were amber, it was going to be considered. So whether the new government is going to use that system, it's difficult to know, and we're yet to find out. So not until the government start really getting into their, because as we know, it's a new immigration minister, still learning the ropes, still learning the policy, only been there for, learning the portfolio, I should say, only been there for a couple of months. So we're not going to see any great changes probably until early next year, if at all, or maybe later in the year. But from what I see, the minister is certainly open to listening and are certainly taking what I consider a much more fairer approach as far as skilled migration, and they've certainly acknowledged the need for skilled migration and the increase in skilled migration to fill the skill shortage gap. So that is good news for all of you here today who are studying, yet to study, just about to complete their studies. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities, and we're going to see a lot more invitations in greater numbers than we've experienced in the last couple of years. So what do you need to do to get ready for to lodge an expression of interest once you've completed your studies, once you've gained your relevant experience or currently gaining the relevant experience? You can always lodge an expression of interest at any time if you meet the minimum points requirement of 65. If you've got an occupation that is on the current skilled occupation list, and if you've got the relevant skills assessment. You do, even though you don't need to have a skills assessment currently for the 485, you still need a skills assessment for this expression of interest. That is the first step. And you also require your English language test. As we know, PTE are here today, and PTE have do a lot of tests and have a lot of opportunities there to sit your tests, and within 2 hours you can gain your relevant decision for your English language, because the higher your English language ability is, the higher the points you are and the more competitive you're going to be. You've got to be aged between 18 and 44, which I'm sure most of you are. And the skills assessment is also relevant as dependent on the occupation that you're currently studying. So some of the more general ones are Engineers Australia for engineers, Australian Computer Society for most IT professions. VetAssess do a lot of the general occupations, Trades Recognition Australia. So dependent on your occupation will be dependent on your skills assessment, and each skill assessing authority requires different things. So you're best to go and check that. But that's what you need. And as I said, the more points you have, the more competitive you are. The easiest way to gain points is through improving on your English language ability and being able to gain the highest points there. Also, being able to obtain as much work experience as you can. You get more work experience working here in Australia than work experience overseas. So, for example, if you've worked in the 12 months full-time in Australia, then you'll gain 5 points. If you've gained 3 years experience in Australia full-time, you'll be able to gain 10 points. Now, full-time work experience, what that means for skilled independent, it's very different from employer sponsored, but for skilled independent, as long as you've done 20 hours per week in your relevant qualification, that will be considered as skilled experience. And the experience is only considered post-qualification. So whilst you might be gaining some experience during your studies, you can't consider that towards your work experience. It has to be post-qualification. And that's why the 485 visa is out there, to give you the ability to be able to gain that relevant work experience. So the other couple of things is, yes, obviously be good health, meet the character criteria, but that's once you get an invitation to apply. So the stepping stones into permanent residency, once you've gained your work experience on the 485, is to obtain a skills assessment, complete an English language test, and as long as you've got the 65 points, you can lodge an expression of interest. To lodge an expression of interest is free to do so, and it will remain there for 2 years unless you get picked up in the interim to have an invitation to lodge a visa application. With the expressions of interest through the state nominations, that's a completely different process and not something that I'll be getting into today. So apologies for my technical or lack of technical skills here with the slides. I really do apologise. I'm not quite sure how that's not quite working, but open for questions. I'm sure there's quite a few there. So Alex, did you want to let me know or start with what questions that are on everyone's mind and what they're keen to know?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you to everyone that was asking questions in the Q&A. We were answering questions in the background, and I want to let you know that members of the PTE team and also Migration Down Under are still answering questions in the chat. So if you have any, make sure that you're asking those. We will get to as many of them as possible. Julie, we have collected a few now. My apologies if you've already covered it in the presentation, but there may be some people that came late, and we just want to make sure that again, we're answering some questions that we hope a lot of our attendees will get the most use out of. So a question here from CM, this actually came through registration, and their question was, can they claim points as a single even if you're going through a divorce? They've been separated for 4 years but was unable to find information from an agent.
Yes, they can. Yes, that is the funny thing, that there are points there for being single, and if you are officially separated but not yet divorced, you can still obtain those points. That's absolutely fine.
Excellent. I'll also just mention that if anyone does want to speak to a registered migration agent, we will pop the link for Migration Down Under in the chat now. And as I mentioned, Alice is in the chat answering questions on Q&A. Before we get to the next question, we're also going to launch a poll really quickly. This will just give us a better indication of the topics that interest you as international students and those of you interested in migrating to Australia. It will help guide us on the information that we share and potential future webinars. So if you could please answer that, that's very, very helpful. Another question for you, Julie. I know that this has been answered a few times, but I'll mention it again because we've gotten it quite consistently. What is the upper age limit for the skilled migration or employer sponsorship program?
Okay, you must be 44 and under to be eligible. And with skilled independent, the younger you are, the more points you gain. So, for example, if you're between 25 and 32, that's the peak time to get the maximum points. And then I think it goes from 33 to 39. And then once you turn 40 to 44, you get less points as you get older. And the reason, or the logic behind that with the government is because they feel that you're getting, as you get older, you're getting closer to retirement, which doesn't really make logical sense when they want us all to work till at least we're 70. But whether that's lifted, it will be interesting to see, because I think 44 in a lot of instances can be, or 45 can still be quite young. So there is no age waiver at all for independent skilled migration or state-sponsored migration for the age. You must be 44 or under. And however, if you were to go through employer-sponsored, again, upper age is 44. But if you're on a 482, working for the same employer for a minimum of 3 years and earning the high income threshold, which is currently 158,500, if you're earning sort of in that vicinity or above, then there may be a possibility to waive that age requirement working for the same employer.
Right. Excellent. A question here from Fauzi. This was in the registration, so hopefully they've joined us for today's session. How can you know if the job that you work in Australia falls under the skilled migration list?
Okay, that's a good question, because some of the skilled occupation lists can be very difficult to find. But on the Department of Home Affairs, and possibly, I'm not sure, on the Insiders Guides, there may be a link to the different skilled occupation lists. And it can be a little confusing because there's so many different lists out there. But if your occupation, even with the 482, the 186 employer sponsored, there's two separate lists, and there's different lists for the 190 and the 189. But the 189, generally speaking, you can find your occupation on the Department of Home Affairs website. If you're seeking a 190, that would be state-sponsored. So you'd best to go and visit the relevant state and territory to see what occupations they're trying to attract, because they put a new list out on the beginning of the 1st of July each year. And again, because there's been a change of federal government, not all the states, I think Western Australia may be the only one to have their new list out there. Not all of them have them out there, so they're probably more likely to release their lists from August of this year.
Excellent, thank you so much, Julie. Question here from Neha, who has said, why has the subclass 189 visa been halted, and is there any chance it will be revived this financial year?
Yes, look, good question. It's certainly being revived this year. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's going to be a 150% increase in allocations for 189 independent visas for this year, this financial year. The reason it was halted for the last 2 years is due to the pandemic, due to the border closures, and the fact that the government were concerned too about unemployment during the pandemic, that if the one on statistics, it shows it takes a long time if the 189 visa holder is not currently in Australia working in that occupation, then it takes a good 6 months or more to find employment in that relevant occupation. And the government are really focused on making certain that people that have the skill set are actually working in their skilled occupation and are not coming out in their occupation and then not being able to gain employment because it's just such a waste of skill set. So that's the reason it's been halted, because of the border closures. Their focus was on those that were already in employment in Australia in their occupation. And the focus was also on family migration, but that's reversed as of this financial year. So I'm sure you'll see a marked difference in the coming months, that there will be a lot more invitations coming out.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Julie. A question here from Subdue, who said, how long does the whole process take? I assume the visa process, assuming you already have your English test results.
Okay, so look, that's a difficult one because processing is all over the place at the moment. Unfortunately, the Department of Home Affairs are not immune to a skills shortage themselves. So they don't have as many case officers processing, and they're trying to sort of balance it out to make sure that where the ministerial direction is of wanting priority processing, they're sort of allocating case officers to there. So in regards to processing, expression of interest, difficult to say. It's all dependent on what your points are. But once you've got an invitation to actually submit and lodge a visa application, I can't tell you how long that's going to take. The best idea is to look on the Department of Home Affairs website. They do have current processing timeframes. I know the subclass 190 has been taking a good year or more, because there has been a halt during the pandemic and they're still trying to work through that backlog. Sometimes you might see that newer applications get picked up and finalised a lot quicker than some of the legacy cases that have been in there a lot longer. So sorry, I can't give you any definitive answer to that question, but you can look on the Department of Home Affairs website under global processing timeframes.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thanks, Julie. That actually answers quite a few questions that we've gotten coming through the chat in terms of how long the process is going to take. They've been waiting for their visa for X period of time. So it's good to know that the Department of Home Affairs does have a place where they list all of the processing times. And yeah, that's just good to know for everyone that's listening that isn't quite sure. Another question here that has come through the live Q&A is from Gerardian, who said, because immigration is constantly changing, at which point of our study should we start taking the present skilled occupation list into consideration? Should we start looking for related occupational experiences in our penultimate year of study, or would it be better to focus on studying and start looking for those skilled experiences once we graduate under a temporary graduate visa?
That's a really, really good question, because I know, it's not always easy when you're studying to find related employment to what you're currently studying. It really is, if you've got the opportunity to be able to find relevant or related employment whilst you're studying, and you've got the time to do it, because I know dependent on the course, sometimes doesn't allow many hours to be able to work, because the course is could be quite sort of intense and requiring a lot more hours than some other courses. Usually through the university, they often have networks or relationships with different employers that are quite keen to provide work experience to current students. So my advice would be to seek advice through your education provider to see what opportunities they have, because they do tend to have relationships or set up joint ventures with employers who are very happy to take on students. And then that often, if you have had that experience, maybe it's only working one day a week to gain a bit of experience and insight into what you're studying. But it's a great way to prove yourself to then, when you do complete your studies, that you're more likely to be picked up and given the opportunity to a full-time position once you've completed your studies. So I don't say wait until the end of the studies. I think try and find those opportunities throughout your studies. And it's all about networking and taking up any opportunities the education provider gives you as far as networking with prospective employers.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Julie. And yes, very much to reiterate, networking is so important as an international student. We get a lot of people coming through to us at Insider Guides saying that they don't realise how much networking is, a tool to finding experiences in Australia. And yeah, as you mentioned, go and speak to your education provider, go and speak to other people, and you can start kind of getting an idea of what you'd like to do in the future. A question here from Jaya Prakash, who said, if I'm starting I'm going to fill some gaps here, but I assume it is, if I'm starting my studies online due to a visa processing delay and the transition to on-campus, would the online portion of the course be considered for a post-study work visa?
Good question. I know there's been some concessions for those that were caught offshore whilst, when they had enrolled, but I can't answer that question with confidence because I'd have to look at, because the regulations are changing all the time in that respect. So it's because it's not so much an inability to be able to come into Australia. It's more the delays on the visa processing that's stopping you coming out. So I am not sure about that. We'd have to come back to you on that one and check that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Julie. Question here from Kane, who said, can you elaborate more on relevant work experience?
Okay, relevant work experience. So relevant work experience is related to your field of studies. So, for example, if you're studying engineering, if you've got some, and engineering's broad, it's dependent. Maybe you're doing civil engineering and you've got a job as a site supervisor, for example, on a construction site. That would be considered as relevant work experience. So if you're working with construction organisations, etc., if you're studying IT and you're working as a software engineer, a developer, you're gaining relevant work experience in your IT field, that's relevant experience. So relevant experience is not any type of experience in an occupation that's on the list if you're not currently studying it. So as I briefly mentioned before, if you're studying engineering, for example, but you're working full-time in a restaurant as a restaurant manager, or maybe you've learned how to cook and you're working as a cook in the back kitchen, that's not considered relevant experience if that's not your field of study. And a lot of people make that error in seeing that hospitality is in demand, it's on many state-nominated occupation lists, and that might be a way for them to segue into permanent residency rather than their preferred and intended field of their career and occupation. Working alone in, for example, hospitality, say for 2 years, where a lot of people have, because whilst if you're here on a student visa, currently there's been a lot of concessions where you can work unrestricted as long as you continue to meet your study requirements. A lot of people have gained at least 2 years work experience in hospitality, and I have a lot of people trying to then apply through skilled independent or state sponsored as a chef or a restaurant manager, but their occupation, they haven't actually studied that. It's not going to get them the desired result, because you still need a skills assessment for any independent pathway to residency, and the skills assessment is not going to be issued on the work experience. It's going to be issued on the qualification. You've got to be very careful for some vocational providers might offer a qualification through recognised prior learning, and a lot of those are not necessarily above board. And a lot of people come to me saying, oh, I've got a qualification as a chef, I've got a diploma in hospitality, but they've gained it all through recognised prior learning. That too is not necessarily going to get you the required result as far as independent pathway to permanent residency. So just be careful of that. There's really no fast track way of getting permanent residency. It's a bit like the story of the tortoise and the hare. Slow and steady will get you the result at the end of the day. Don't try and shortcut it. And so just going back to relevant experience is working in your field that you're currently studying. So hopefully that's clear. I know I probably segued into another area there, but tried to sort of cover it and give you a general overview of what's needed.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julie. So many of today's attendees are asking for the application procedure for their specific country of origin or nationality. Does the procedure actually change depending on where you're from?
No, it doesn't. No. And now that the government is inviting offshore candidates, then there's absolutely there's no boundary to apply if you're actually offshore. Up until our borders opened, yes, they weren't opening to offshore applicants. Even the state and territories who are offering state nominated positions, they are also looking for offshore. So now that our borders are open, It doesn't matter whether you're onshore or offshore. Obviously, if you're onshore and you've studied here in Australia and you've gained work experience in Australia, it is going to be an advantage to you if you're offshore, because you gain further points, you gain more points because of your studies in Australia, your work experience in Australia. And as I mentioned, the more points you gain, the more likely it is that you're going to get an invitation to permanent residency. But if you're offshore and you've completed your studies and you've got the relevant work experience overseas, you need to have a minimum of 3 years work experience overseas to gain any form of points for offshore work experience. Then there's no difference in being able to apply. The pathway is exactly the same. You still need to get a skills assessment, and that's still through the Australian assessing authorities. And you still need to do an English test. And I know PT are global, the PTE are global, so you can sit your test wherever you are, and you can apply wherever you are. So there's no difference from offshore or onshore processing.
Wonderful, thank you, Julie. So if anyone is looking for an English test, as Julie just mentioned, we are joined today by PTE, so we'll pop a link to them in the chat now. A question here from Miriama, and it was quite specific to their circumstances, so I've just altered it a little bit to ensure that as many people can gain benefit from your answer. So they're saying that they've graduated in Australia but had to return to their home country as part of a scholarship. Are they still able to return to Australia having served that time away and apply for a graduate visa?
Yes, it depends on the type of student visa. Some of them that are scholarships are very restrictive, and the expectation is for them to return back once they've completed their studies, and there's conditions in their visas that prevent them from being able to lodge a further application, such as a graduate visa. So it's unfortunate where there's quite a lot of restrictions for government-sponsored student visa applications. So the expectation from that home country is that they come back and use their skill set in that particular home country. So I would recommend that once they do gain their experience there, that they can then seek to come back to Australia, either as an independent, or maybe they can come through employer-sponsored, even if it's temporary, that will step them in, be a stepping stone through to permanent residency.
Wonderful, thank you, Julie. And a final question today: if there is anyone in today's session that is seeking advice or support or needs questions answered regarding their migration to Australia, where should they be going and who should they be speaking to? Because there are some places where obviously you wouldn't want your information to come from when you are migrating to Australia.
Certainly, that's a really good question. And you do need to be careful if you're overseas and taking advice from overseas, because overseas operators are not governed by the Australian governing authority, whereas all people that provide immigration advice in Australia must be either a registered migration agent through the Office of the Migration Agents Registration Authority, or have to be a lawyer that is holding a full unrestricted legal practicing certificate. Now, just be aware that since deregulation, whereby lawyers now don't have to be a registered migration agent and they can practice in the area of law, if you're seeking advice from a lawyer, make sure that they are an accredited specialist in immigration, because lawyers here in Australia that do not actually study immigration as part of their degree qualification. And also be aware that lawyers, you don't necessarily need to go to a lawyer and look at the years of experience. If they're a registered migration agent, the first two numbers in their registered number will indicate the year that they were registered. So that will show how many years experience they've had. So do your homework, ask for references, ask for other relevant experience that they've had. Make sure perhaps sometimes that they're not operating alone, because that sometimes is fraught with danger if they're not usually experienced in that particular area. And also be aware that whilst you may seek advice for your to gain a student visa or to gain information about a course of study, you go through an education agent. That's perfectly fine to choose which study you're going to be or which course you're going to be studying. But education agents, unless they're a registered migration agent, cannot give immigration advice. And I see so many sad stories where people have chosen wrong courses or gone down the wrong pathway because they haven't been advised correctly. So be aware that anyone giving immigration advice, you should see that they're a registered migration agent or an accredited specialist in immigration law if they are a lawyer. You don't actually need, a lot of people think, oh, I need a lawyer, but a lawyer, the only difference is if you had a visa refused through the tribunal and you have to attend court, that's the only time you need a lawyer. Otherwise, we practice and do exactly the same type of work. The Migration Institute of Australia, a professional body, a member association body that registered migration agents and lawyers and our members that all have to follow a code of conduct and have high ethics. So that's always a good way of perhaps finding a registered migration agent through the OMARA link or through the MIA, Migration Institute of Australia. But choose wisely.
Wonderful advice there, Julie. Thank you so much for sharing that. So that brings us to the end of today's Future Abroad session. If you are planning to take a PTE test, as we mentioned, a lot of people are in the chat discussing English language tests. Knowing how to get the best use of the limited preparation time is key to achieving your dream score. Next Tuesday, which is the 19th of July, tune into the webinar Preparing Your Way to the PTE Academic Success to find out about the most suitable preparation methods for you and to improve your chances of success. As an added bonus, each registrant will receive 15% off all of their PTE prep products. We'll pop a registration link in the chat now so that you can save your spot for next week's session if you would like to join. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to you, Julie, for all of your time and your wonderful presentation today. As we've mentioned, a recording will be emailed to everyone that joined us today, and we will have all of your slides there for everyone if they weren't able to take the notes in time. But again, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and all of your expert advice, and to the Migration Down Under team for answering so many questions in the Q&A as well. That has been a wonderful opportunity for people to get answers to their questions directly. A huge thank you to you, the audience, so much for giving up a little bit of time on your Thursday afternoon, joining us live. Please make sure to check the Future Abroad website. We'll pop a link to that in the chat now. That is where you will find out about all future events that we'll be hosting, along with a lot of really important information for international students. And finally, a huge thank you to today's sponsor, which is PTE. They support your English language requirements for Australia. Again, a huge thank you to everyone for joining us today, and we will see you at the next Future Abroad session.